The chair jolts under my weight, a sharp kick from my son sending it into the table. Move, he spits, and I swallow the sting of his words. Still, I don't respond, my hand resting on my glass, fingers cold against the ice. As the anger settles, so does the realization, the power I've given him, the power to hurt. While he rants, I gather my resolve. That night, I make the call. The next morning, his accounts are empty. And for the first time, I feel the quiet weight of control. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The evening was cool, a brisk March wind sweeping through Wichita's quiet streets, carrying the faint scent of rain that hadn't quite fallen yet. Nancy Rollins stepped out of her car, the tires crunching on the gravel of the restaurant's parking lot. The soft glow of neon lights flickered above her, casting long shadows that stretched across the sidewalk like the ghosts of a past that wouldn't let her go. She adjusted her scarf, pulled it tighter against the chill, and walked toward the entrance of the family restaurant, a nondescript place where the booths were worn and the air smelled of grease and old coffee. Inside, the hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware filled the room. She scanned the space, spotting them at a corner booth. Kylie was already sitting, her back straight, her smile the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. Nancy felt the familiar sting of that smile, the coldness that always followed the pleasantries. "Hi, Mom," Kylie said, her voice syrupy sweet but laced with something sharp beneath the surface. Nancy smiled back, faintly, and lowered herself into the seat across from her daughter-in-law. Kylie didn't offer her the warmth of a hug. That wasn't surprising. Dean, her son, was already half into his meal, a glass of beer in front of him, eyes locked on the menu, but his jaw tight. His face was that familiar mask of irritation, the same expression he wore when he had no patience for anything, or anyone. "How's Maddie?" Nancy asked, keeping her tone light, though she knew the question would set him off. Dean didn't even look up. His fork clinked loudly against the plate as he stabbed at his food, jaw tightening. "She's fine," he snapped. Nancy's stomach twisted. She had heard the tone before, the dismissive edge like he couldn't be bothered. But it wasn't like she could ask more. She felt the weight of the silence, the space between them, growing heavier by the second. The conversation shifted. Kylie's attempts at small talk barely grazed the surface. Nancy played along, offering polite responses, but her mind was elsewhere. She could feel the tension building between her and Dean, an invisible cord pulling taut with each passing minute. Her thoughts drifted back to their early days, to when he was a child. Back then, they had shared moments that felt like they could stretch forever. Tender moments in between his tantrums and moods. Now, at 45, he was a stranger. He didn't want her in his life. Not really. Not unless she was useful. Dean's voice sliced through her thoughts. "God, Mom, will you just let it go?" he muttered, eyes flashing, voice rising just enough to make other diners glance over. Nancy's fingers tightened around her glass, the ice clinking softly. She looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a pang of something like regret. She had tried so hard for so long to be there for him, to help him through his messes, but he never appreciated it. "You never—" Dean started, his voice full of venom, but before he could finish his thought, he stood up abruptly. "Let's go," he snapped, his words sharp, like they were meant to cut. The table trembled slightly as he shoved his chair back. Nancy hesitated, taking a slow breath, willing herself not to react. She had no intention of following him, no intention of rushing. Her knee ached from years of wear, and it wasn't easy to move quickly anymore. She glanced at Kylie, who was already gathering her things, her face impassive, but somehow smug. The dinner had gone off the rails, and yet, Neither of them seemed bothered by it. Move, Dean barked suddenly, a harsh command, his face twisted with frustration. Before Nancy could even react, she felt it. A sharp, jarring blow to the back of her chair. His foot connected with it, hard enough to jolt her forward. Her knee slammed into the table with a sharp crack. The noise echoed around the restaurant, slicing through the murmur of conversations. The room went still. Nancy's heart thundered in her chest. The pain in her knee was immediate, a flash of white-hot fire, but it was the shock that stole her breath. The violence in his gesture, the complete disregard for her, hung in the air like a fog. For a long moment, all she could do was stare at the space where his foot had connected with the chair. His eyes were narrowed, angry, but there was no apology, no regret. Just that sneer. Move, he repeated, a bit louder this time, like a command to a servant, his words cutting through her like a knife. The air around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her reaction. Nancy didn't move immediately. She didn't speak. She just stood up, slowly, deliberately. Her hand brushed against her old financial binder, tucked into her purse, and the faintest memory of her own resolve filled her. She walked away from the table, from the restaurant, her movements measured and sure. She wasn't running. She wasn't even angry. She simply walked away. As she passed through the door and into the cool night, she didn't look back. But she knew, with a sharp clarity, that things had just changed. And this time, she wasn't coming back. The car's engine hummed low, almost rhythmically, as Nancy Rollins gripped the steering wheel with both hands. The world outside blurred in her peripheral vision, dark streets lined with empty houses, their windows glowing faintly with the warmth of homes she would never step into again. The cold March wind pushed against her windshield, creating jagged patterns in the rain-streaked glass. Her headlights sliced through the night, but the road ahead felt like an endless void, as though she were driving into a place that had no end, no destination. Her fingers ached around the wheel, not from the tightness but from the weight of everything that had just happened. The dinner. The slap of Dean's boot against her chair. The way he'd ordered her, like she was nothing. His eyes had burned with such contempt, and that, more than the pain in her knee, was what had stung the most. The finality of it all. He had pushed her so far, and now, there was no going back. But there would be no tears. Not tonight. Nancy took a slow breath, her chest rising and falling with a quiet determination. She wasn't going to let herself crumble. Not this time. Not over him. Not over any of them. She'd given them everything. Her time, her money, her patience, and they had thrown it all back in her face. And for what? For this? To be treated like an afterthought? She turned onto her street, the familiar curve of the road suddenly feeling like foreign territory. When she saw the porch light flicker on, she knew someone was out there. Walter. Of course. He was always watching, always waiting. It was how he was, how he'd always been. A neighbor who kept his eye on the world, who saw things before anyone else. Nancy eased the car into her driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel, and cut the engine. The silence settled over her like a heavy cloak. She sat for a moment, letting the cool air seep through the cracked window, the scent of damp earth mingling with the faint perfume of old leather from her seat. The night felt alive in ways that she wasn't sure she could explain. The hum of the universe distant, but undeniable. She stepped out of the car and didn't bother to close the door behind her. Walter was already walking toward her from his house, his frame silhouetted against the porch light. His steps were slow but steady, his gait that of a man who had seen everything. His eyes, sharp but kind, studied her for a moment before he spoke. "Good evening, Nancy," Walter said, his voice a soothing, gravelly baritone that seemed to calm the air around them. She nodded, but didn't speak right away. Instead, she walked slowly toward the porch, each step deliberate, as if she had just crossed an invisible line she couldn't uncross. Walter followed, but he didn't press her to talk. Not yet. She sat down in her rocking chair and exhaled slowly, staring out into the dark. Walter sat beside her, his presence comforting without a word. "What happened?" he asked, the question simple but layered with all the understanding he'd built over years of watching her, of knowing how much she had taken. Nancy didn't look at him. Instead, her hands folded in her lap, the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her chest. She wanted to say something sharp, something biting about Dean, about Kylie, about all the years of watching them squander everything she gave them. But she couldn't. Not yet. "He kicked my chair," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "Told me to move." Walter let out a soft, low breath. He didn't need to say anything more. He didn't have to. He had seen this coming, even if Nancy hadn't fully admitted it to herself. "You don't owe that man a cent," Walter said, his tone sharp, like a man who had lived long enough to know the cost of people's manipulations. He paused, then added, "Not anymore." Nancy closed her eyes, her mind running through the years, decades, really, of what she had done for Dean, for Kylie. She had always been the one to fix things. She had always been the one to step in, to fill the gaps they created with their irresponsibility and their selfishness. The late bills, the overdue credit cards, the vacations they couldn't afford, the emergencies that never stopped. It had always been her. She had helped them when no one else would, but she had never gotten anything in return. Not real thanks, not respect. She reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against the old, worn binder that she had carried with her for years. It felt heavy now, more than it ever had before. Slowly, almost reverently, she opened it, her hands tracing the tabs, the records, the proof of all the years she had covered for Dean's mistakes. When her fingers landed on the tab labeled Dean Joint Accounts, she felt a jolt of something, a rush of cold, hard clarity. For a long time, she had kept her involvement in their financial messes at arm's length, hoping it would resolve itself. But now, as the cool wind rustled through the trees around her, Nancy realized something fundamental. She had all the power she needed to walk away, to take control of what had always been hers. Dean had kicked her chair, and in doing so, he had forced her to finally see that it was time to take back everything he had drained from her. Her fingers curled around the binder and her gaze hardened. "No more," she muttered under her breath. The quiet of the night seemed to swell around her, the stillness echoing her resolve. Walter didn't ask what she was planning. He didn't need to. But Nancy knew. The game had changed. The accounts, the money, everything. It was all about to be different. And this time, there would be no going back. The light from the desk lamp flickered as Nancy pulled the old financial binder closer to her, the familiar weight of it grounding her in the quiet of her living room. The room smelled faintly of lavender, a scent she'd used to calm herself after long days of waiting for phone calls that never came, waiting for Dean and Kylie to finally take responsibility for their choices. Now, she could hardly breathe in the stillness. It was as if every breath was a reminder of everything she'd put up with for years. Walter sat across from her at the small kitchen table, a large mug of black coffee in front of him. His hands were steady as he flipped through the papers she handed him, scanning each document with the same quiet precision he had when they'd first started talking about Dean's financial mismanagement years ago. His eyes flicked up to her once, his face unreadable, before he turned back to the papers. Nancy ran her fingers over the well-worn tabs in the binder, each one labeled meticulously: Dean, Emergency Fund, Dean, Credit Card Payments, Dean, Bills. She had always kept track, kept her distance but close enough to pick up the pieces when everything fell apart. Now, as she carefully opened the first tab marked Dean, Joint Accounts, she couldn't help but feel a sudden rush of something. Nervous excitement? Fear? For a moment, the numbers blurred in front of her eyes. She blinked, steadying herself. The statements were older than she expected, the dates on the records pushing back a decade. Yet there they were, old accounts that she had set up when Dean had begged her for help. Back then, she'd believed him. She had been there for him, over and over, just as she had been there for him as a child when things got difficult. But this time, as she ran her eyes down the list, the names on the accounts were hers as much as they were his, accounts he had long since forgotten about. Walter, who had been quiet for several minutes, spoke again, his voice a low murmur. "I can help you put this all together. We need a timeline. Every time you bailed him out, every time you covered for him." Nancy nodded, absorbing his words, though part of her recoiled at the thought of reliving the years of endless rescues. Each transaction, each withdrawal, each loan had been done out of love, out of duty. But now it all felt like a trap she had set for herself, one she'd walked into willingly. She thumbed through the papers, stopping at a stack of monthly statements, each one filled with emergency loans she had signed off on, bills paid, overdrafts covered. The totals seemed to climb higher with each passing year, until the number on the last sheet was staggering, more than she'd ever realized. She let out a quiet breath as her eyes lingered on the final balance, a figure that made her chest tighten. She was angry now, not just at Dean, at herself. Walter's voice broke the silence, sharp and steady. "This is where you stopped getting paid back. This is where you started footing the bill for everything." Nancy nodded but didn't speak. She felt the bile rise in her throat as she processed what she had just uncovered. All those times she had stood by him, tried to fix things for him and Kylie, only to watch them squander everything. They had never thought about the long-term cost, had they? She hadn't let them. As she reached for another pile of documents, something caught her eye. An old check stub. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked it up. Her name scrawled across the bottom, followed by the amount she had written on the check. A large sum, a lifeline at the time. Dean had needed it. They'd all needed it. But now it felt like a betrayal, a promise broken. She carefully placed the check aside and reached for the next set of statements. This was it. The moment when she had no more excuses. The moment when everything became clear. She had been blinded by love, by hope. She had tried so hard to keep things from falling apart, to keep him from drowning, but it was over now. Walter, still flipping through the papers, paused. "Nancy, these accounts. You're still attached to two of them. Accounts you never touched after you gave them the initial lifeline." Nancy's gaze snapped to his. "What?" "Two of them," he repeated, his voice calm. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes. "You never closed them. You have legal access. They're still there." Her pulse quickened. She knew, deep down, that this was the moment when everything changed. Her fingers hovered over the paper. She couldn't breathe for a second, the weight of the realization crushing her. He didn't know. He had no idea that she was still linked to those accounts, and she was going to take back everything she'd given him, everything he had drained from her over the years. Walter leaned forward, sensing her shift. "You've got a chance, Nancy. You can make him pay, and not with money." She glanced up at him, her eyes sharp, the fire in them burning brighter now. She knew what she had to do. Her fingers wrapped around the pen she kept by the binder, and she began writing down the words that Dean had spoken to her at dinner, the words that had been the last straw. Move. With each stroke of the pen, the resolve in her grew. She wrote it down. felt the sting of it again, and with that, she closed the binder. Everything was about to change. Dean would never see it coming. The first light of morning was weak, struggling against the cold gray of the March sky. Nancy stood in front of her mirror, the reflection of her own tired eyes staring back at her. The house was silent, and for the first time in years it felt like she could hear the echoes of her own thoughts, clear and sharp. The decision had been made the night before, but now came the quiet, meticulous work of following through. The sun had barely crested the horizon when she stepped into her car, the engine purring to life as she pulled out of the driveway. The world outside was still and empty, the streets quiet in the way they only were before the chaos of the day began. Nancy drove, not for the first time, through her own neighborhood, but now it felt different. She wasn't just another resident going about her business. She was someone with a plan that would change everything. At precisely 8 a.m., Nancy pulled into the parking lot of the small office complex on the edge of town. The sign for Carla Merritt's estate and trust law office was unobtrusive, tucked between a dry cleaner and a dusty pawn shop. It was the sort of place where business got done without fanfare, where legalities were handled with the cold precision of those who knew how to work within the system. Nancy climbed out of her car, a soft sigh escaping her lips as she adjusted the strap of her purse. It was heavier today, weighted with something more than just the binder she carried with her. It was the weight of all the years, the regrets, and now, finally, the clarity. She walked inside, the bell above the door jingling softly as she stepped across the threshold. Carla Merritt was already there, sitting behind her desk, a stack of legal documents in front of her. Her office was neat, the kind of place that looked like it belonged to someone who wasn't just a professional, but a strategist. Carla's reputation for handling fiduciary matters had earned her the kind of respect that came only from doing things the right way. Or, in Nancy's case, the cold, calculated way. Carla looked up as Nancy entered, a brief smile crossing her face. It wasn't the warmest smile, but it was knowing. It said, "I understand." "Morning, Nancy. Have a seat," Carla said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Nancy took it without hesitation. Carla's gaze flicked over her, as if assessing her mood, before she spoke again. "I reviewed the documents Walter sent over. You've got everything in order. You're fully within your rights." Nancy nodded, her mind already racing ahead, the weight of it all pressing on her chest. "We'll start by closing the accounts," Carla continued, her tone steady and methodical. "You'll revoke his access to everything, and I'll prepare the full trust forms. I'll also make sure there's a clause in there that prevents any further manipulation." Nancy listened closely, her eyes scanning the legal papers laid out on the desk. She felt the slow, steady tick of the clock on the wall, a reminder that time was moving forward, and there was no going back. She had no interest in going back. "Once we're done," Carla added, her gaze meeting Nancy's with quiet intensity, "Dean and Kylie won't have a leg to stand on. This isn't just about the money. It's about you taking control of your life. It's about them understanding that there's a price for everything they've taken from you." Nancy's throat tightened. She wasn't used to hearing words like that from anyone, especially not someone like Carla, who dealt in the legalities of wealth and inheritance. But today, those words felt like something she could finally breathe in. Carla went through the forms with Nancy, explaining each step with the precision of someone who knew the system inside and out. They discussed the revocation of Dean's access, the creation of a trust for Maddie, and how to ensure that nothing could be undone once the papers were signed. As Nancy reviewed the documents, she could almost hear Dean's voice in her head. "Move." It echoed like a cruel joke, something that had been said without thought, without regard for her years of care. But now, the power was back in her hands. She wasn't the one being moved. She wasn't the one being pushed around anymore. Walter had been right. There was a chance now, an opportunity to show them that she wasn't going to keep cleaning up their messes. And when she left here today, she'd be taking the first step toward reclaiming what was hers. Nancy glanced over at Carla, who was already finalizing the paperwork. The attorney was the picture of calm, but there was something in her eyes now, something that suggested she understood exactly how far Nancy had come to get to this point. "I'll prepare the final documents for you to sign this afternoon," Carla said, her voice no longer just professional but firm. "Once that's done, we move forward. They'll never see it coming." Nancy stood, her pulse quickening with each step she took toward the door. Her mind was already 2 steps ahead, planning what came next. Carla's voice stopped her just as she reached the door. "One last thing," Carla said, her gaze locking onto Nancy's. "Make sure you're ready to stand firm. Once these documents are in motion, there's no turning back. And Dean will try to push. He won't go quietly." Nancy's hand tightened on the doorknob. Her chest rose and fell, but this time it wasn't with regret or fear. It was with certainty. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. And for the first time in years, Nancy Rollins believed it. The morning felt quieter than it should have, like the world was holding its breath. Nancy sat at a long, polished conference table, the weight of the pen in her hand a constant reminder of what was about to happen. The thick legal documents lay in front of her, their stark, official nature almost alien to her. She wasn't used to this world of cold paperwork, but here she was, about to make the decisions that would forever change the lives of her son and his wife. Carla stood beside her, watching closely, her demeanor calm, professional. But there was something behind her eyes, an understanding perhaps, of the monumental act Nancy was about to commit. Walter was at the far end of the room, his presence a quiet anchor. He was the one who had insisted that she bring everything to this point, ensuring that there would be no turning back once the ink was on paper. Nancy's hand hovered over the first document, her pulse a steady rhythm in her ears. She was so close now, so close to the end of a long, painful chapter. The accounts, the loans, the endless financial rescues that had kept Dean and Kylie afloat for years, today, they would all end. With one stroke of her pen, she would sever ties that had held her in a chokehold for far too long. "Do you understand what's at stake, Nancy?" Carla asked, her voice low and purposeful. Nancy nodded slowly, her eyes focused on the signature line. "I do." The moment felt thick with gravity, as though the air itself was laden with the past. The weight of Dean's words, "move," still stung. But now, they felt hollow. He had no idea how much of his future depended on the action she was about to take. He had no idea how little power he held now. She signed the first document, the pen scratching sharply against the paper, a sound that reverberated through her, setting off a wave of quiet satisfaction. Each signature on the form was like a release, a final cutting of the tether that had kept her bound to the mess he had created. "Done," Nancy said softly, the word feeling almost surreal as it left her lips. Carla nodded, a small but knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "We'll close all joint accounts, remove his access, and move everything into a protected trust. You're legally within your rights to do this, and once we file, there's no undoing it." Nancy glanced up at Carla, feeling a surge of something. Anger, relief, empowerment, all mixed together. This wasn't just about money. This was about taking back her life. This was about showing Dean that there were consequences for the years of manipulation, the endless demands, the disregard for her sacrifices. The next form was already in front of her, waiting. A request to withdraw her portion from each account. She paused for a moment, the gravity of the decision sinking deeper. Her portion, the money she had always quietly put aside, never asking for repayment, never expecting anything in return. But now, she would take it all back. She would move it into a trust that Dean couldn't touch, couldn't drain any longer. This was her move, her final act of control. Her fingers trembled slightly as she signed the next line. The money would be hers, and it would be protected. Dean would never see it again. Carla began typing quickly on her laptop, preparing the necessary revocation forms. Nancy felt the weight of it all shifting with each step. Her future was being secured, the pieces of her life finally falling into place. As Carla prepared the trust documents, Nancy glanced over at Walter. He was reviewing the notarized copies, his expression unreadable, but she could see the approval in his eyes. He had been part of this plan from the beginning, helping her piece it together, making sure she was ready to take this step. "You're making the right choice," Walter said, his voice low, but the sincerity in it made Nancy's chest tighten. "He won't understand it now, but he will." She wasn't so sure about that. Dean might never understand why she had done this, why she had cut him off when he least expected it. But Nancy didn't need his understanding. She only needed her own peace of mind. When Carla handed her the final trust document to sign, Nancy hesitated for a moment. This was the last step. After this, there would be no going back. Her eyes flicked over the document, seeing her intentions laid out clearly. Nancy Rollins, the sole trustee. Maddie Rollins, the beneficiary. Dean and Kylie's names were conspicuously absent from the trust, erased from the future Nancy was building. She signed the last document. "This is it," Carla said, her voice almost reverent as she filed the papers. "You've taken control." Nancy let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The knot in her stomach began to loosen. This was it. The future she had worked for. The life she had put on hold for so long was finally coming back to her. Walter walked over, his calm demeanor a steadying presence. "I'll make sure these are filed today. It's all in motion now. Dean and Kylie won't have access to a thing." Nancy rose from her chair, a strange sense of clarity washing over her. The house was no longer the same. Her life was no longer the same. She had stood up for herself in a way she never had before. She had fought for herself in the only way that made sense. Carla handed her a final piece of paper, a list of automatic transfers that had been made from her accounts, money that had been drained without her consent. "You should delete these," she said. "You don't want any reminders of what they took." Nancy took the paper, her gaze hardening. She didn't need to be reminded anymore, she already knew. As she left the office, her hand holding the signed trust forms, a single thought rang clear in her mind. Dean would come for it. He would demand answers. He would blame her for everything. But she would be ready, and this time, she wouldn't move. The phone sat beside Nancy, its screen flashing incessantly with the constant arrival of messages. She had turned the ringer off hours ago, just after leaving Carla's office, the trust papers securely tucked into her purse. The quiet hum of her living room, the soft murmur of the television playing in the background, felt so alien now. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her, her every breath shallow, every thought pointedly focused on what she had just done, and what was coming next. She reached for the phone once, then pulled her hand back, her fingers twitching. The screen blinked with a flood of notifications. An endless barrage from the same names. Dean, Kylie. They were relentless. But not once did she unlock the phone. Not once did she open a single message. She had already known what they would say. "Where is it? Why did you do this? You can't do this to us." They were probably already drafting angry texts, letters, phone calls, all demanding answers they didn't deserve, blaming her for what she had to do. But Nancy wasn't in a rush to hear it. She wasn't in a rush for anything anymore. Her thumb hovered over the screen, but her resolve held steady. She didn't need to read their words. She didn't need to hear them anymore. There was a strange peace in knowing that what she had done could never be undone. No matter what they said, no matter how much they screamed or tried to twist the truth, it was done. The trust was in place. The accounts were closed. Her control was absolute now. The clock ticked on, each second like a soft thud of finality in the room. Nancy's phone buzzed again. Another message. She didn't look. Instead, she went to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, her hands steady as she drank deeply. She could feel the burn of it at the back of her throat, a reminder that she was still here, still breathing, still in control. When she returned to the living room, she saw that her phone was practically glowing with notifications. Carla had warned her that it would be a barrage. Everyone would try to get to her to back down. Dean and Kylie would push, test her, threaten her. They would call her manipulative, cruel, ungrateful. The thought didn't scare her anymore. What scared her now was how little she felt for them. Her gaze flicked to the list of messages that had stacked up while she was in the kitchen. But she didn't open any of them. Instead, she opened the app that controlled her finances and changed every password she had, updated every verification method. The security measures were airtight. There was no room for error now. Dean had no access. Kylie had no access. And she wasn't going to let them find a way back in. Nancy deleted the old automatic transfers too, each one that had bled her dry over the years. Those tiny withdrawals had added up to something bigger than just money. They had taken a piece of her soul, drained it quietly over time. But no more. Not today. Another buzz, another text. Nancy's stomach tightened, but she didn't look at it. Instead, she glanced at the clock. 2:32 p.m. The messages had been coming in for hours. But she wasn't ready yet. Not until everything was secure. Kylie's posts had already started to hit social media. Passive-aggressive jabs about manipulative elders and toxic family members who destroy everything for their own satisfaction. Nancy could almost hear Kylie's voice behind the words, the sugary sweetness laced with venom. She was sure Dean would be involved soon enough. Maybe even before the day was done, they would both storm over to her house, demanding explanations. Demanding something she no longer had to give. But there was something else, too. A message from Maddie. It was short, unlike the others, but it landed like a gut punch anyway. "I'm sorry. Please be safe." The words sat with her like a weight on her chest. Nancy closed her eyes for a moment, letting the tightness in her chest loosen. She hadn't heard from Maddie in days. The girl had been so quiet. Too quiet. She wanted to call her back, to tell her that she was fine, that she was safe, that everything would be okay. But what could she say to her? That everything would be fine, now that Dean and Kylie were cut off? She set the phone down and walked to the window, her fingers pressing lightly against the cool glass. Outside, the world continued as it always had. People going about their business, the sun pushing through the gray clouds, casting an odd sort of warmth across the street. It was a perfect scene of calm, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shatter the peace. Dean and Kylie wouldn't take this lying down, but there was no going back. She thought about Maddie again. Her daughter had to see this, had to understand what was happening, what had finally broken in Nancy. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. Another buzz, this time from Walter. "They've started. Carla's logged everything. Stay firm. Stay firm." A simple message, but the weight of it hit her harder than any of the others. Nancy stood there, her reflection in the glass, staring back at her with a steady, unwavering gaze. This was it. There was no more running, no more saving, no more waiting for the impossible to fix itself. Dean would come for her. Kylie would accuse her of everything. But it didn't matter anymore. She wasn't going to move. not this time. And they would have to deal with it. The phone vibrated again, the low buzz cutting through the stillness of the room like a constant reminder of everything Nancy had just severed. The notification popped up on the screen. Unknown number. Her fingers twitched, hovering above the phone. For a split second, she considered answering it, just to hear their voices, to hear Dean's bluster or Kylie's venom. But she knew it would be a mistake. It would be the start of a chain she didn't need to start. She didn't need to hear them accuse her of being cruel, of being a manipulative mother. She didn't need to let them drag her back into their mess. With a slow, deliberate motion, she swiped the screen, holding her breath for just a moment before she hit the block button. The phone went silent. It felt like cutting the last tie, the final act of removing them from her life. Not just financially, but emotionally. She had been available to them for too long, at her own expense, at the expense of her peace, her happiness. Now, she was done. Nancy set the phone down, exhaling as if she had released a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. She could feel her pulse racing, almost like she had been holding herself together for so long, and now it was all starting to hit her. This was really happening. The doorbell rang just then, cutting through the moment of quiet. Her body stiffened. No one came to visit unless they had something to say, and everyone she needed to hear from had already said their piece. She walked slowly to the door, her steps deliberate, as if preparing herself for what she would see when she opened it. It was Walter standing outside, a quiet strength in his gaze. His eyes weren't angry or accusing, like she feared Dean's might be. No, Walter looked at her like someone who understood, who had seen her rise to this point and would stand with her through it. "Everything's in order," he said, his voice low, measured. "I've reorganized the safe. All the necessary documents are secure." His eyes moved to the phone in her hand, now sitting silent on the kitchen counter. "I've also got Carla's letter ready. The cease contact letter. It'll hold up in court if they keep trying." Nancy nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. It felt like too much. She'd already made so many decisions, taken so many steps. Was this what strength felt like? Or was it just exhaustion wearing a new face? Walter stepped into the house, pulling his coat tighter around himself against the cold that still lingered in the air. He offered her a small smile. "You've done what you needed to do, Nancy. No more worrying about them. It's over." But was it? Was it truly over? Nancy didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked back into the living room and took a seat, staring out of the window. She could hear the faint rustle of the spring wind picking up outside, carrying with it the scent of the earth beginning to warm. A soft, clean wind, but it made her feel unsettled. The calmness of nature was so stark compared to the storm inside her. It was like the world was moving on, but she was still standing here, at the edge of something she had never expected to have to face. Walter placed a piece of paper on the table in front of her. Carla's cease contact letter. The legal terms, the official wording, it was all right there. She could almost hear Dean's voice in her head, the way he would lash out, the threats he would surely make. He would try to intimidate her. She knew that. But she wouldn't flinch. She had already crossed the point of no return. Her fingers traced the edge of the paper, the sharp corners pressing into her skin like a reminder that this wasn't just an idea anymore. This was reality. This was happening. Walter's voice broke through her thoughts. "You've made your move. You've taken control. Now let them react however they want. You've given them the truth. You've done what's right." Nancy closed her eyes for a moment. She could feel the weight of everything. The years of giving, the years of putting herself last, trying to fix what she didn't break. She had spent so long in the role of the caregiver, the fixer, the one who never complained, never expected anything in return. But somewhere along the way, They had stopped seeing her as a person. They had started seeing her as a tool. A bank account with legs. Someone they could lean on without ever considering the cost to her. She had loved them. She still did. But that didn't mean she could keep sacrificing herself for them. She could no longer be their safety net. The net had holes now, and it was time for them to learn how to stand on their own. The phone buzzed again. It wasn't a call this time. It was a message. Nancy's fingers moved to pick it up. But before she could even glance at the screen, Walter spoke. "Don't," he said firmly. "Let it go. You don't owe them anything." And for the first time, Nancy didn't argue. She set the phone down again, more decisively this time. The silence in the room felt more comforting than any message could. The world outside was still waiting for her to take that next step. But for now, she could breathe. "I'm writing her a letter," Nancy said quietly, breaking the silence. "Maddie." Walter paused, then nodded. "Good. She deserves to know the truth. She deserves to know you did this for her too." Nancy's fingers curled around the pen, the sharp click of it filling the quiet room. She began writing, her thoughts flowing as she expressed the raw honesty she had never been able to give before. But somewhere between the first word and the last, something shifted inside her. This wasn't just a letter. It was the first thing she had written for herself, not for anyone else. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first time she had done something that was just for her. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and for the first time in a long time, it sounded like freedom. The phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't just another frantic message from Dean or Kylie. It wasn't even a threat or an accusation. It was a letter, formal and cold, sent from Dean's attorney, accusing Nancy of financial manipulation. Nancy's fingers tightened around the phone as she read the words. The accusation stung more than she expected, a twist in her gut that made her head swim for a moment. Financial manipulation. The phrase rolled off the screen like venom. It was the ultimate irony. They had drained her for years, used her for their mistakes. And now, after she'd finally taken control, they were turning the tables, painting her as the villain. Her lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. It wasn't the first time she had been painted as the bad guy, but it didn't make it sting any less. She set the phone down on the table, her breath steadying as she turned to face Carla, who was already scanning the email with practiced professionalism. "We expected this," Carla said, her voice calm but sharp. "It's standard. They try to cloud the truth. It's a last-ditch effort to put pressure on you." Nancy's mind raced. The letter from Dean's lawyer felt like a trap, a tactic designed to get under her skin, to make her second-guess herself. They would try to make her feel guilty, like she was taking something she had no right to. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was in the paperwork. Her paperwork. The signed documents. The legal rights. She was no longer the one being manipulated. Carla, already ahead of the game, had already begun drafting a formal response. She slid a set of papers across the table to Nancy, her eyes steady. "These are the documents I've prepared to counter their claim. Your financial history, the records of every loan, every payment, every transfer. You've got every right to do what you did." Nancy took the papers, her fingers grazing over the neat rows of figures, the organized evidence of her years of sacrifice. For a moment she felt the familiar weight of regret in her chest, until she remembered the finality of her actions. She wasn't responsible for their mistakes anymore. The phone buzzed again, this time from Kylie. The message was a post, as expected, something designed to publicly accuse her of being manipulative, an emotional vampire. Her words were laced with accusations and hurt, painted with a narrative of how toxic elders can destroy families with their manipulative greed. Nancy exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing as she read the post. Kylie had always been good at spinning the story, at playing the victim while keeping her hands clean. But this time, there was nothing to hide behind. The truth had already been set in motion. Walter, who had been silently watching from the side, stood up and moved to the table where Nancy's phone lay. "I've been saving her posts," he said, his tone steady but clipped. "Screenshots, every word. We'll archive everything, in case this turns into something uglier." Nancy didn't answer at first. She let Walter's words sink in, understanding the weight of what he was saying. It wasn't just about protecting herself anymore. It was about protecting the life she was building. One free from the constant drain that had been Dean and Kylie's hold on her. She reached for her phone again, her fingers trembling slightly as she navigated through her settings. It was time. Time to finalize everything. With a few quick taps, she updated her healthcare proxy, making sure that no one, not even Dean, could have a say in her medical decisions. She restructured her power of attorney to ensure that everything would remain in her hands, no matter what. As she set the phone down, there was a sense of finality, a sense that the old Nancy was gone, and someone else, someone stronger, more resolute, was taking her place. There was no turning back now. A soft chime sounded as a new message appeared on her screen. It was from Maddie. Nancy opened the message, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words. It wasn't a rant or an accusation. It wasn't a demand for answers. It was a drawing. It was a simple sketch, but it hit her like a wave. In the center of the page was a figure of Nancy, drawn in the softest lines, standing tall with a key in her hand, a key that seemed to radiate light. Around her was a large lock, encircling her, protecting her. "I'm sorry. Please be safe." Tears pricked at Nancy's eyes as she looked at the drawing. Maddie understood. She understood what Nancy had done and why she had done it. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting her daughter. She was ensuring that Maddie would never have to live in the shadows of guilt and obligation the way she had. Nancy felt a surge of warmth inside her, a sense of pride. Maddie might not understand all the complexities, but she would learn. She would learn that sometimes survival meant making hard choices, and sometimes survival meant standing firm, even when the world tried to tear you down. She set the phone aside, her eyes still on the drawing, her heart swelling with something new. Hope. For the first time in years, she could see a future that was truly hers. A future she could shape without fear, without manipulation. But there was one more thing to do. One final piece of the puzzle. Nancy stood up and walked to her desk, pulling open the drawer where the last of the important documents were kept. With steady hands, she reached for the will she had updated just a few days ago, before any of this had even come to light. It was simple. Maddie, the sole beneficiary. No one else. Not Dean. Not Kylie. No one. She sat down again, looking over the changes she had made. There was a quiet sense of satisfaction in knowing that the future was no longer in Dean's hands. And soon, it wouldn't even be in Kylie's. They would have to face the consequences of their actions. And Nancy would be free. The wind outside had quieted, the branches swaying gently in the trees. The world, at least for now, was at peace. But Nancy knew better than to think it would stay that way for long. The chime from the doorbell echoed through the quiet house, sharp and insistent. Nancy didn't flinch. She didn't have to guess who it was. She knew. For a moment, she stood perfectly still in the middle of the living room, the phone in her hand trembling ever so slightly. But she didn't need to answer it. She didn't need to open the door. She had already made her decision. Slowly, she walked over to the wall, her eyes locking onto the small security camera above the door. Her fingers brushed against the cold glass of the camera monitor, the screen flickering to life. Dean's angry face appeared on the feed. His jaw was clenched, eyes wild with a mix of rage and desperation. His hand slammed against the door in rapid succession, his knuckles white with force. He was yelling something, but the camera's sound wasn't on. It didn't matter. His posture, the way his body was shaking with anger. She could tell what he was demanding. The same thing he always demanded. That she fix everything, make it right again. Restore the accounts. Undo this. I need that money. Nancy exhaled slowly, her heart steady but her thoughts sharp. There was no sound in the room now. Only the image of her son outside, completely unaware of the strength she had just summoned to get to this point. She could feel the old temptation, the desire to open the door and give in, to apologize, to placate him, to somehow make it all better. She had been that person before, but not anymore. The camera feed zoomed out slightly, showing Dean pacing in front of the door, his hands on his hips. He was muttering under his breath, probably cursing her, blaming her, imagining every reason why he was entitled to the money. Nancy had seen this behavior before, felt the push and pull of his demands, but today she felt nothing but a quiet calm. She didn't respond. He knocked again, harder this time. Each blow against the door sent a small ripple through the frame, but it didn't shake her. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was just noise. Nothing more than the hollow sounds of someone trying to hold on to power that had already slipped from their grasp. Nancy turned from the screen and walked toward the window. The rain had started again, soft and steady, streaking across the panes of glass. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, the world holding its breath in anticipation. The sound of Dean's fists pounding against the door grew louder, more frantic. He was shouting now, his voice thick with frustration. The words blurred together in a fury of entitlement, but it didn't matter. Nancy knew the truth now. She knew that she wasn't the one who had taken anything from him. He had taken from her for years, using her kindness, her sense of obligation, and now, when she finally said no, he couldn't handle it. But Nancy had already made her decision. Just as she moved back toward the door, the pounding stopped. There was a long pause, a brief silence that felt like the eye of the storm. Then, a voice echoed from the porch, distant but cutting. "You think you can just take everything from me? You think you can ruin me and walk away? You're going to regret this, Mom. You'll see. This isn't over." The finality in his words hit her harder than she expected, but not in the way he probably intended. His threat was hollow. It no longer had the power to shake her. The truth was, he had been manipulating her for years. And now, for the first time, she had the upper hand. A moment later, there was movement at the edge of the yard. Dean was pacing back and forth on the driveway, his anger pulsing like a visible force. His shoulders were tense, his mouth a grimace as he muttered to himself, likely cursing her name, plotting his next move. But he didn't approach again. Instead, he turned sharply and stormed off, his figure retreating down the walkway, a man who had lost the only battle he was ever going to win. Nancy stood there watching, not moving an inch. When he was finally out of view, she let out a breath, slowly releasing the tension she hadn't realized had built up in her body. And then, just as she was about to turn away from the window, she saw it. Walter's shadow appeared on her porch. He had come out onto his own porch just in time to witness the tail end of the confrontation. His eyes met hers through the window, and she saw the quiet approval in his gaze. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. Nancy walked back to the phone, her hands steady now. She picked it up and typed a message to Carla. "He came. I didn't open the door." Carla's response came back almost immediately. "Good. Keep the doors locked. It's over, Nancy." Nancy let the phone fall onto the couch, her fingers running over the back of the chair where she stood. The weight of everything felt lighter now. The final step had been taken, and for the first time in a long time, the future was hers to shape. But she knew something that Dean didn't. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. The truth was out. The power was in her hands, and he wouldn't go quietly. Still, Nancy wasn't afraid. This was her life now, and no one was taking it from her again. She wasn't moving. Not this time. The courtroom was sterile and cold, the air heavy with the muted sounds of shuffled papers and low murmurs. The walls, beige and unremarkable, seemed to press in on Nancy, but she stood tall, her spine straight, every fiber of her being focused on the moment unfolding before her. This wasn't a place she was used to, but here, in this room, she had the power. She had taken it from him, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. Dean was seated across from her, his posture stiff and defiant, though the faint tremor in his hands betrayed his anxiety. He had tried to look composed, but his eyes darted around the room, unable to settle. He had underestimated this moment. He had underestimated her. The judge, an older man with graying hair and an expression of practiced indifference, leaned forward, his gavel still untouched. His eyes flicked between the two of them, his gaze briefly lingering on Dean before he spoke. "Mr. Rollins," the judge began, his voice dry but steady. "You claim your mother's actions were irrational and unjustified, but you have yet to present any compelling evidence that this is the case. Do you care to elaborate?" Dean opened his mouth, but the words were slow to come. His jaw worked, frustration flashing in his eyes, but there was no fire in his delivery, no conviction to back up his claims. Nancy's fingers tightened around the edge of the witness stand, but she didn't need to say anything. This was his moment to convince the court, and he was already faltering. "My mother, she—" Dean started, but his words caught in his throat, his voice rising to an almost frantic pitch. "She took everything from me. My money, my access. She didn't give me a choice. She acted out of anger." Nancy glanced at Carla, who sat at her side, quiet but resolute. Carla had already anticipated this. She had prepared for the inevitable theatrics Dean would put on, and she wasn't about to let him get away with it. The attorney for Dean fumbled with his papers, his eyes darting to his client, as if searching for something to salvage from the mess. But Carla was already standing, poised and calm, her presence in the room commanding respect. "Your Honor," Carla said, her voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "Let me present what Mr. Rollins conveniently overlooks, the truth, the documents that prove beyond any doubt that my client, Nancy Rollins, had every legal right to do what she did." She stepped forward and handed the judge a thick stack of neatly organized papers. The judge flipped through them slowly, his eyes skimming over decades of financial history. Tax returns, loan records, withdrawal slips. Every piece of paper told a story, Nancy's story. "Every loan, every withdrawal," Carla continued, her voice measured, each word deliberate. "Every time Mr. Rollins fell short, his mother was there. And every time she extended help out of compassion, not obligation. But Mr. Rollins never made an effort to change his behavior. Instead, he saw her as a bank, a tool to be used when convenient." The words hit Dean like a physical blow. His face twisted with anger, but he was speechless. He couldn't deny what Carla was laying out for the court. It was all there in black and white. Every payment he had neglected, every debt he had left for Nancy to pick up. His mouth hung open, but there was no way to refute the truth now. Nancy watched him, her gaze steady, and for the first time in years, she felt nothing. No pity, no guilt. She didn't care how uncomfortable it made him. This wasn't about him anymore. The judge glanced up from the papers, his eyes narrowing as he took in the full scope of the evidence. "Mr. Rollins, you claim that your mother acted irrationally, yet you have offered no evidence of manipulation or coercion. What you're describing is the result of years of neglect, of your own actions. Is that not the case? Dean's face flushed, but he remained silent. He couldn't answer because the truth was too painful. He had no leg to stand on. Kylie, who had been sitting quietly in the back, suddenly stirred. Her whispers cut through the room like knives, and Nancy caught the sharp edge of her words as she spoke to someone beside her. She's ruining everything. She's always been manipulative. Nancy didn't flinch. She had heard those words for years, and each time they had been used against her, they had only served to reinforce the truth. She wasn't the one who had broken this family. She wasn't the one who had lied, who had manipulated. That was on them. The judge cleared his throat, shifting his gaze to the court reporter who had been carefully documenting every exchange. Then, he turned back to Dean. "Mr. Rollins," he said, his voice softer now, but with an unmistakable authority. "You've made your claims, but the evidence presented here today suggests a different story. I find no reason to overturn your mother's actions." Dean opened his mouth again, but the words were lost in the air. There was no arguing with what had been laid out. There was no arguing with the truth. Kylie's furious whispering reached a crescendo, but the judge cut her off. "Ms. Rollins," he said, "I suggest you maintain decorum in this courtroom, or I will have you removed." Kylie stiffened, but the weight of the judge's words had already diffused her anger. She fell silent, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and rage. Nancy could feel the heat from the back of the room, but she didn't turn around. Her gaze stayed on Dean, who was slowly deflating before her eyes. His facade of anger was crumbling, and for the first time, he was facing the full weight of his irresponsibility. Carla, standing beside Nancy, gave her a brief, approving glance. Then she turned to the judge. "We request that the ruling be made in favor of Nancy Rollins, that the trust remains intact, and that Mr. Rollins no longer has access to any of the accounts." The judge nodded, his gaze softening just slightly as he turned to his papers. "I will review the case and make a final ruling shortly. Court is adjourned." Nancy stood slowly, feeling the heavy silence of the room shift around her. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The battle was over. She had won. As she walked out of the courtroom, her feet felt lighter than they had in years. The future was hers. And this time, no one was taking it away. The courtroom was quiet, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. Nancy sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes focused on the judge as he reviewed the new set of documents laid before him. The color-coded financial statements she had meticulously organized, each transaction, every loan, every repayment, every withdrawal, spoke for her in a way her words never could. It was the truth, laid out in sharp relief, free from manipulation or distortion. Dean sat across from her, his shoulders slumped, his earlier bravado completely deflated. The attorney who had once been so quick to claim that Nancy had acted out of malice now fidgeted, scrambling for a response that would never come. He couldn't defend the indefensible. He couldn't rewrite the story of years of financial irresponsibility and deceit. Carla, poised and calm, stood next to Nancy, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the table. She had been the architect of this defense, the one who had walked Nancy through every step, ensuring that not only would they win the case, but that Nancy's side of the story would be heard loud and clear. Carla had seen this moment coming, and now, as the judge flipped through the pages, it was becoming undeniable. "Your Honor," Carla said, her voice steady and confident, "as you can see, the statements provided by my client reveal a clear pattern, one of responsibility and careful management. For years, Nancy Rollins covered Mr. Rollins's debts, bailed him out of financial crises, and extended every possible loan to him. What you see in these statements is a woman who acted out of love, not manipulation." The judge, a man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, paused for a long moment as he continued flipping through the pages. His expression remained unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. He was absorbing the facts, weighing the evidence without the influence of Dean's outbursts or accusations. Nancy sat back in her chair, her back straight but relaxed. The tension that had once plagued her every decision, every step she had taken, had melted away. This was the culmination of everything she had done over the years. She had made the right choices, ones based on love and logic, and now the weight of the truth was undeniable. Dean's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that the fight had already been lost. There were no more words to salvage his client's case. He glanced at Dean, who, despite the fact that his face was still flushed with anger, looked more defeated with each passing moment. The judge finally set the last sheet of paper down, his expression unchanged. "Mr. Rollins," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a cold wind, "I have seen no compelling evidence that Nancy Rollins acted improperly. The records clearly show that, while her actions may have been motivated by compassion, they were not manipulative in nature." Dean's lips parted, but no words came. The anger that had once burned so brightly inside him was now replaced by something else, a quiet, seething frustration that he had no outlet for. His claims were unraveling, piece by piece, until all that was left was the bitter taste of defeat. Nancy's gaze remained unwavering, her posture steady. She had walked this path for so long, silently carrying the weight of her son's mistakes, trying to fix what wasn't hers to fix. But this moment, this was hers. She had taken control, and it had been worth every second of the fight. The judge paused again, and the tension in the room thickened as he adjusted his glasses, finally looking up at the parties involved. "I find in favor of Nancy Rollins," the judge said, his voice ringing with authority. "The trust remains intact, and Mr. De Rollins no longer has access to any of the accounts. I suggest that this case be closed." A small wave of relief washed over Nancy, but it was quickly tempered by something deeper, something more permanent. It wasn't just about winning. It wasn't about the money. It was about her reclaiming her life, her dignity, and her peace. Carla gave her a brief, knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement of the victory they had achieved together. Walter, seated in the back, caught her eye as well, offering a small but proud smile. He had been by her side through all of this, a steady presence through the storm. As Nancy stood to leave the courtroom, she felt the weight of the last few years lift from her shoulders. She had been tested, pulled in so many directions, but now she could breathe. She was free. Dean remained seated. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Kylie's furious whispering filled the room as she stood, but Nancy didn't turn back. She didn't need to hear their accusations or their anger. They had no power over her anymore. The future was hers to shape. Walking out of the courtroom, the weight of her decisions felt lighter than it had ever been. The world outside was still gray, the clouds hanging heavy. But there was a sharpness to the air that felt new. Nancy's future had already begun. And this time, she was the one in control. The gavel slammed down, the sharp crack of it ringing in the air like a bell tolling the end of an era. Nancy sat still, her eyes focused on the judge as he declared his final ruling. The room, once filled with tension and accusations, was now bathed in the quiet certainty that Nancy had fought for and had finally won. After reviewing the evidence presented, the judge's voice boomed in the now silent courtroom. "I find in favor of Nancy Rollins. The trust remains intact, and Mr. Rollins will no longer have access to any of the accounts. Furthermore, I dismiss Mr. Rollins's claims with prejudice. This case is closed." The words echoed in Nancy's mind, and for a moment it felt unreal. She had won. The future she had fought for, The future that had once seemed so far away was now hers to shape. It was hard to process, to allow herself to feel the full weight of the victory after so many years of uncertainty. She could feel her breath come easier now, as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. Dean's face, once twisted with anger, was now devoid of expression. The fight had been drained from him. The words he had yelled at her, the threats, the accusations, they didn't matter anymore. The truth had spoken for itself, and it was final. Kylie, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, couldn't hold herself in anymore. Her face turned a deep shade of red, her eyes flashing with a fury that had only grown since the verdict was read. "This isn't over," Kylie spat, standing up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You're not the victim here, Nancy. You've destroyed this family." Nancy didn't react. Not even a flicker of emotion passed across her face. She had heard this before. Every time she had stepped in to help, every time she had extended her hand, this was the gratitude she received. But it didn't matter anymore. It was over. Kylie stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. Each step a final punctuation mark in her exit. Nancy didn't need to watch her leave. She knew it was just one last act of defiance from someone who couldn't understand why the rules had finally changed. A message vibrated in Nancy's pocket, and she reached for her phone. She'd been waiting for this. The court case was over, but there was one person whose response she cared about. She unlocked her phone, and her heart fluttered as she saw the simple message that Maddie had sent. "Congratulations, Mom. You did it. I'm proud of you. Be safe." Nancy's breath caught in her throat. Maddie's words, so simple yet so full of understanding, filled her chest with warmth. It had been a long time since she'd felt truly seen by her daughter, but Maddie had known all along. Maddie understood the sacrifice, the years of putting everyone else first. Nancy smiled softly, the edges of her lips curving upward as she typed a quick reply. "I did it for both of us. I love you. Always." As she hit send, she felt something shift in her. This wasn't just a legal victory. This was a reclamation of her own life. She was no longer a support system to be drained and discarded. She was her own person again. A person who had finally taken control, who had set boundaries, and who had reclaimed her future. Nancy stood up slowly, her legs steady despite the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The courtroom felt less imposing now. She walked out into the hallway with a sense of quiet pride. The world outside still felt heavy with the weight of the day, but it also felt different, lighter, like the storm had passed. As she stepped outside into the crisp air, the wind had picked up, swirling around her, tousling her hair as she looked up at the gray sky. It was still cloudy, still overcast, but the clouds no longer felt like a looming presence. They felt like a part of the past, something she had overcome. Nancy took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. She had won. She was free. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive again, and it wasn't just the relief of a legal victory. It was the peace that came with knowing that she had finally done what was right for her, for Maddie, and for the future they would build together. As she walked away from the courthouse, her phone buzzed once more, but this time she didn't need to check. She knew it was a new message from Maddie. This time, Nancy wouldn't be afraid to face whatever came next. She wasn't alone anymore, and this time, she wasn't moving. Not for anyone. The final draft of the trust lay on the table before Nancy, its pages crisp and cold beneath her fingers. Carla stood by her side, a quiet, reassuring presence. The decision had already been made, the papers prepared, and now, this was the last step. The moment when everything would be sealed, when Dean would finally lose his claim on everything Nancy had worked for, everything she had sacrificed for. Nancy felt no sense of triumph as she reached for the pen, only a deep sense of finality. The ink that would mark her signature wasn't just a formality, it was the quiet conclusion of a battle that had raged for years, unseen, unacknowledged by most, but always there, simmering beneath the surface. Her hand hovered over the dotted line for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over her like a cloak. It was the last connection to him, the last tie that bound her to the son who had drained her emotionally, financially, for so long. She glanced at Carla, who offered a small, knowing nod. There was no need for words. They both knew what was at stake. With a deep breath, Nancy signed. Her name, neat and steady, filled the line. The document was officially hers now, as much as it had always been, but now it was more. It was the physical manifestation of the control she had finally claimed, the barrier between her and the people who had manipulated her for so long. Dean Rollins, her son, was disinherited. The words felt like they should have been a heavier blow to her heart, but there was no sorrow, no regret. She had mourned that loss years ago, back when he had first used her, when his irresponsibility had pushed her to the brink. This wasn't a punishment, it was a necessity. Maddie's name, though, was written carefully in the document that would ensure her future. Nancy's heart softened just a little as she wrote her daughter's name at the top of the page. Future beneficiary. It was for Maddie. Always for Maddie. The one person who had never taken, who had always understood, even when she didn't know everything. Carla leaned over and took the trust documents from her, her eyes scanning the finalized versions. "This is done," she said, her voice smooth, but with a note of satisfaction. "This is airtight. Dean's access is revoked, the assets are protected, and Maddie's future is secure." Nancy didn't respond immediately. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes tracing the sharp edges of the trust documents, as though she could see the weight of the decisions in the ink. Everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. It was all here, in these pages. In a few simple steps, everything was set. Walter entered the room quietly, his presence like a shadow, always steady, always watching. He took the stack of papers from Carla's hands, his expression calm as he looked them over. "I'll store the copies in your safe," he said, his voice low, but it carried a quiet confidence. "No one will be able to tamper with this." Nancy stood, feeling a strange kind of peace wash over her. It wasn't joy, not exactly, but something deeper. Something that had been missing for so long. She didn't have to worry about Dean anymore. She didn't have to be the one holding everything together for him. It was over. Her eyes flicked to the binder on the desk, the one she had kept for years, its edges frayed from all the years of paperwork, of sacrifices, of keeping everything in order. She picked it up, opening it to the final page. This was it. This was the last piece of the puzzle, the final document that would make her vision complete. She pulled out a pen and added a final note to the binder. Something personal, something just for her. She wrote slowly, her hand steady as she filled the page with words that had never been easy to put down. Words she had kept to herself for years. "For too long, I put others before myself. But this is mine. This is for me and for Maddie. It's time to finally live for what I want, for the future we'll build together." Nancy closed the binder with a soft snap, feeling the weight of the decision settle around her. She placed it back in its spot, on the shelf, where it had sat for years, but now, with a new purpose. Carla and Walter exchanged a brief look. Neither said anything, but there was no need for words. They both knew that Nancy was finally free, finally in control of her life in a way she had never been before. Nancy took one last look at the trust documents before standing, smoothing her blouse as she turned toward the door. There was a finality to the moment. The future was set. As she stepped outside, the cold air hit her face. fresh and invigorating. The gray skies hung above, but the clouds didn't feel like a weight anymore. They felt like a distant memory, something she had outgrown. She took a deep breath, feeling the crispness fill her lungs. It was as if she had been holding her breath for years, waiting for this moment. And now, for the first time, she could exhale. The wind swirled around her, tousling her hair as she stood there on the steps of the house. The past had been long and painful, but it had led to this moment, to this freedom. And this time, she wouldn't be moving for anyone. Not ever again. The porch swing creaked gently as Nancy sat beside Maddie, the two of them enveloped in the quiet of the late afternoon. The sky above was still overcast, the clouds thick but soft, a muted gray that felt like a blanket wrapped around the world. The air was cool and calm, and the breeze had picked up slightly, carrying the faint scent of rain and freshly cut grass. For the first time in a long time, Nancy felt no weight on her shoulders. The house around them, once a symbol of her burdens, now felt like a place of solace. There was peace here. Real peace. Maddie leaned her head on Nancy's shoulder, her body trembling slightly. Nancy felt the subtle shift of her daughter's breath, the silent tension that had been coiled tightly in her chest now beginning to unravel. Maddie had been so quiet during the past few days, so composed, but Nancy could feel the release, the weight of the decision that had been made finally catching up with her. "Maddie," Nancy began softly, brushing a lock of her daughter's hair back from her face. "It's over. We're safe now." Maddie nodded. But when she spoke, her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "I'm just so glad, Mom. I didn't know if you'd ever get out from under all of that. I didn't know if I'd ever feel like we could finally be okay." Nancy squeezed her daughter's shoulder, offering a gentle smile. She understood. She understood the years of strain Maddie had endured, the worry that had settled in her eyes every time Dean's calls went unanswered, every time the financial problems had spiraled again. Maddie had been too young to take on the burden, but somehow she had done it anyway. Always the caretaker, always the quiet observer of the chaos that had been her family. "I'm not going anywhere," Nancy said, her voice firm but warm. "I promise you, we'll build something better from here. I'll make sure of it." Maddie finally let out a soft sigh, her breath shaky but relieved. Slowly, she tilted her head back, looking at the sky with tears glistening in her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness anymore, but of something deeper, something that had been held back for far too long. "Thank you," Maddie said, her voice a little stronger now. "Thank you for doing this, for standing up for us, for me." Nancy wiped away the stray tear that escaped Maddie's eye. "You don't ever have to thank me for that. You're my world, Maddie. Always have been. Always will be." A quiet moment passed between them, and for the first time in years, Nancy didn't feel the need to explain, to apologize, or to reassure anyone. They sat together in the silence, the simple act of being with each other enough to fill the space between them. Walter appeared on the lawn, his presence as steady and unhurried as ever. He had been a constant in Nancy's life, and though she hadn't fully realized it until now, she saw just how much he had been a part of the strength she had found in herself. He walked over to the porch, a tray of fresh lemonade in his hands. "I thought you both might need something to cool off with," Walter said with a small, knowing smile. He handed Nancy a glass, then passed one to Maddie, who accepted it with a grateful nod. "Thanks, Walter," Nancy said, her voice warm with gratitude. She took a sip of the lemonade, its tartness cutting through the air and refreshing her in a way that felt more profound than just the drink itself. It was a symbol of the simplicity she had yearned for, the things that had always been there but had been buried beneath the weight of so many years of struggle. Maddie took a sip as well, the glass gently trembling in her hands as she looked out over the lawn. There was something peaceful in the way she held the glass, something deliberate and content. For the first time in a long time, it seemed like Maddie wasn't just surviving. She was starting to truly live again. Nancy set her glass down on the small table beside her and stood up slowly, her gaze falling on the shelf just inside the door where the old binder sat. It had been with her for so many years, through every financial decision, every step toward trying to fix the unfixable. But it wasn't needed anymore. The future wasn't bound in the yellowed pages of old records and transactions. It was here, in the present, in the fresh air, and the quiet moments with her daughter. She walked inside to retrieve it, running her fingers over the familiar worn cover. The binder had served its purpose, but it was time to close the book on that chapter. She flipped it open one last time, adding a note at the very end, something simple and final. The past is done. I choose the future. A future that is mine and Maddie's. I choose peace. With the pen in hand, she closed it, feeling the weight of the decision settle once again. She set it down on the shelf, its place now complete in the history of her life. When Nancy returned to the porch, she felt different, lighter, freer. It wasn't just the act of signing the final documents. It wasn't the completion of a legal battle. It was the act of finally living for herself. The wind shifted slightly, a soft breeze that felt like a gentle reminder of everything that had been released and everything that was still to come. Nancy sat back down next to Maddie, who smiled at her with a newfound brightness in her eyes. "Mom," Maddie said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm really glad you're my mom." Nancy's heart swelled with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. A future that had once seemed uncertain was now a path she could walk with Maddie beside her. It was no longer about the past. It was about building something better, together. And then, as if on cue, Nancy reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass keychain, a simple, steady reminder of the journey ahead. She placed it on the table, the cool metal gleaming softly in the fading light of the afternoon. It was hers, and it was finally time to move forward. The auditorium buzzed with quiet excitement, the soft hum of conversation blending with the gentle rustle of programs and the occasional clap of a hand. The air was filled with anticipation, the kind that always preceded something meaningful. Nancy sat in the front row, her gaze unwavering, her chest swelling with pride. It had been a long time since she'd allowed herself to truly enjoy a moment like this. Pure, untainted joy. Maddie's showcase was something they had both worked toward for so long, a goal they had set together without the weight of anyone else's expectations dragging them down. It was Maddie's night. Nancy's heart fluttered as she scanned the crowd. She could see the other parents, their faces bright with pride for their children. But it was her daughter who stood out, not because of the applause or the spotlight, though those were deserved, but because of the quiet strength in the way she carried herself. It was the look in Maddie's eyes as she prepared to step on stage, a kind of quiet confidence that Nancy had longed to see in her. There, in the back of the auditorium, stood Dean and Kylie. They were out of place, standing awkwardly near the back, their eyes darting around the room, avoiding the gaze of anyone who might notice them. Nancy could feel them there without needing to turn around. They were watching, waiting for something. But not for her. Not for Maddie. They hadn't seen the real change that had taken place in their lives. Not the way Nancy had. They were still clinging to a past that was already gone, unwilling to accept that their access to her life had been severed. Dean, though, seemed different today. His posture was stiff, his jaw tight with a frustration he couldn't quite hide. He had nothing left now. No access to the accounts, no claim on anything she had worked for. Not anymore. The spotlight shifted, and the room fell into a hush. Maddie walked onto the stage, her eyes scanning the audience before they landed on her mother. A smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Nancy's throat tightened, and she blinked back a sudden surge of tears. This was it. Maddie's moment. Nancy watched her daughter as she took her place, poised and graceful, standing confidently before the crowd. Maddie was glowing, radiating a strength that Nancy had always known was there, but had only now begun to bloom. And then, in that moment, there it was. The sound of applause. But it wasn't just the crowd clapping. It was Maddie's own sense of achievement. She had made it. She was free to be who she was, to thrive without the burden of the past crushing her every step. The performance was beautiful, a culmination of everything she had worked toward. As Maddie took her final bow, the room erupted in applause. Nancy was on her feet before anyone else, clapping with all her might, the joy of the moment washing over her in waves. When the curtain closed, Maddie ran off stage, her face flushed with excitement. Nancy stood there waiting, her heart racing in her chest. The moment Maddie was in front of her, she pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. "You did it," Nancy whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you. You're incredible." Maddie hugged her back tightly, the relief in her eyes palpable. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Mom." Carla appeared from the side of the stage, her expression proud but professional, carrying the certified trust packet in her hands. She smiled as she approached, handing Nancy the folder with a nod. "You did it," Carla said, her voice warm but businesslike. "Everything's official now." Nancy took the packet, the final piece of the puzzle that would seal her new reality. She opened it carefully, the documents inside now tangible proof of everything she had fought for. The peace, the future, the security Maddie would have. From the back of the room, Dean and Kylie stood in silence, watching. Nancy could almost feel the weight of their frustration, their disbelief at what had unfolded. Dean's face was flushed, his gaze flicking between Nancy and Maddie, the realization sinking in. There was nothing left for him to claim now. He had nothing. He walked toward the aisle, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and something deeper. Something that, for the first time in years, wasn't directed at Nancy, but at himself. Kylie, silent beside him, shot a final glare at Nancy before they both turned and left the auditorium, their exit as silent and defeated as it had been when they first entered. Nancy didn't look back. She didn't need to. The past had already been rewritten. As Maddie and Nancy stood together, watching the crowd begin to disperse, Nancy could feel a soft smile creeping across her face. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a whole new story, one where they would write their own rules. As they walked out of the auditorium, hand in hand, Nancy felt the soft brass keychain in her pocket. The one that had been a symbol of everything she had reclaimed. It was small, simple, and steady. But it was hers. Dean might have kicked her chair at dinner, but the next morning his accounts were empty.